The collection's scale deepens the effect. The museum emphasizes that the house was furnished with the contents of dozens of railway carriages, a physical transfer of court life from Germany to the Netherlands. That means the rooms do not feel sparsely symbolic. They feel materially complete, saturated with the textures of aristocratic routine: paintings, silver, porcelain, tapestries, and furniture selected not only for beauty, but for familiarity. A visitor can sense how carefully the exile was engineered to feel like continuity. And yet the museum also forces a different kind of question. What, exactly, is being preserved here? It is not only the biography of Wilhelm II, it is a snapshot of a political class at the moment it stopped being a governing reality and became a historical memory. In that sense, the house is not neutral. It holds the aesthetic and domestic side of monarchy: comfort, ceremony, lineage, without the state structure that once justified it. That gap can feel like silence in the rooms, as if the objects are speaking in a language that no longer has a government to translate it. The mystery is sharpened by how deliberate the time capsule feeling is. Wilhelm chose which objects would surround him. He chose what would be brought across the border and what would be left behind. He chose how the rooms would present him to visitors and, whether he intended it or not, to future generations. The estate does not show the empire at its height. It shows the empire after its collapse, curated by the man who refused to accept collapse as the final story. Even the practical details feel charged with symbolism. During exile, Wilhelm's movement was limited to a small radius unless permission was sought, and he reportedly disliked the humiliation of having to inform local officials. That limitation helps explain why the house became so central. If the world shrank, then the house had to expand in meaning. Dawn was not only where he lived, it was where he staged a life that could still feel imperial. As a museum, Who is Dawn continues to carry that tension. It is a preserved household and a preserved argument. Its rooms invite viewers to experience the intimacy of power, but also to notice how power can become decoration once the political structure disappears. The mausoleum in the gardens makes the message unavoidable. The exile did not end with a return. It ended with a burial, and the unresolved intrigue lingers in the quiet places, between the unchanged furniture and the outside world that moved on without it. Was Who is Dawn preserved because it is historically valuable, or because it is historically useful, a warning shaped into rooms? Was it spared dispersal because the Dutch state recognized the rarity of a complete imperial household in exile, or because dismantling it would have been like tearing apart evidence? The house does not answer. It simply remains, arranged as it was, holding the last domestic silhouette of a forgotten king whose empire ended in 1918, while his private world, improbably, still stands as if the next knock at the door might be his. Wilhelm remarried in 1922 to Princess Hermine Ruys of Greiz, and the household continued its careful performance of order. But the fundamental condition did not change. He remained a man whose titles belonged to history more than to politics. The Dutch queen, Wilhelmina, despite family ties that helped justify asylum, refused to meet him, a social distance that mirrored the political one. He was safe, but never fully welcome, and that tension colored the atmosphere of the estate. The longer the exile lasted, the more Huis Dawn functioned as a controlled environment meant to resist change. The rituals of court life, formal meals, controlled access, hierarchies among servants, became less about tradition and more about insulation. Meanwhile, new currents moved through Europe: authoritarian politics, propaganda, and the approach of another war. The old emperor's presence became a contested symbol again, useful to some, uncomfortable to others, and impossible to fully erase. What makes these years at Dawn feel mysterious is not that they are undocumented, but that the house itself seems to have been designed as an argument against time. It held the material culture of an empire that had officially ended in 1918, and it held it in the domestic form, the way it looked when power lived at home. That is a different kind of preservation than a state museum achieves. It is preservation done by the person who lost everything, who then rebuilt the visible surface of what he had been: chairs, portraits, silver, tapestries, until the rooms could tell the story he wanted told. And yet, the story keeps slipping. If Whose Dawn was meant to be an island of the old world, it was also proof that the old world could be packed into rail carriages and moved like cargo. The emperor could preserve objects, but not outcomes. He could maintain etiquette, but not authority. Over time, the estate began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a sealed chamber, holding a life that could not be resumed. The quiet of its rooms was not peace. It was suspension. History paused, waiting for a verdict that never arrived. By 1940, the world outside Whose Dawn had caught up to the fears that lingered beneath its polite routines. The Netherlands was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, and suddenly the former emperor's exile was no longer happening at a safe distance from German power. The estate, once a controlled retreat, now existed inside a country under military occupation. For a place built to seal out history, it had become impossible to ignore history's footsteps at the gate. Wilhelm II died at Whose Dawn on June 4, 1941. The timing matters. He did not die in the quiet aftermath of the First World War, when Europe was still settling into new boundaries. He died during the Second Great Rupture in an occupied Netherlands, with Germany once again dominating the continent. If Whose Dawn had been built as a refuge from the consequences of 1918, it ended as a stage where the consequences of the next conflict were already visible. He was buried on the estate, inside a mausoleum in the gardens. In that decision, there is an eerie completeness. The man who had crossed the border in November 1918 never returned to live in Germany. Even in death, he remained inside the perimeter he had chosen, as if the exile's boundary had become permanent. The mausoleum made the estate more than a residence. It made it a tomb of a political era, literally rooted in Dutch soil. After his death, the fate of the house could have followed a familiar path. Great collections often scatter. Estates get sold, cleared, renovated, repurposed. But Whose Dawn did something stranger. It held. Some accounts describe the estate as sealed off during the occupation, adding to the sense that it had become a guarded site rather than a private home. Whether guarded, watched, or merely maintained, the house continued to exist as a complete environment. Its rooms still arranged, its objects still placed as Wilhelm had left them. When the war ended, the political meaning of the estate changed again. The Dutch government seized the property as enemy assets after the German occupation. This act could have led to dispersal, but instead it led, eventually, to preservation. In 1956, Whose Dawn opened as a museum. And here, the sealed since 1918 idea becomes more than a poetic phrase. The museum is known for the fact that the interior has not been changed since Wilhelm's death. Visitors walk through rooms that still look like an inhabited home from another age, not a reconstructed exhibit built after the fact. The furniture is not arranged to illustrate a theory, it is arranged the way a household once ran. That decision, keeping the interior essentially frozen, turns Whose Dawn into a rare historical object in itself. Many royal residences survive, but they evolve. They absorb new reigns, new styles, new politics, and new narratives. Dawn does something different. It presents the late imperial world as it looked in private, reduced to human scale and locked into place by the very person who had the most to lose by letting it fade. From the beginning, House Dawn operated like a time capsule under construction. The house did not pretend to be neutral. It was filled with reminders of command, ceremony, and dynastic continuity. Even the staff structure reinforced the atmosphere of a court, reduced in size but not in attitude. He kept German retainers, employed Dutch staff, and attempted, within practical limits, to preserve the rhythms that had once governed palace life. The larger story of the early exile is not simply that an emperor lost his throne. It is that he refused to let his daily surroundings admit it. And so, the mystery at the heart of the estate takes its first shape. Why move so much, so carefully, for a life that could have been lived quietly? Because House Dawn was never intended to be merely comfortable. It was intended to be proof to himself, to visitors, and to an imagined future, that the world of 1918 had not fully vanished. In the quiet rooms of a Dutch country house, the artifacts of monarchy were arranged like a ritual meant to hold back the present. The empire had ended, but here, behind gates and hedges, Wilhelm tried to keep one part of it sealed against time. By the time the furniture was in place and the portraits had found their walls, House Dawn began to feel less like a refuge and more like a private kingdom with no subjects. The daily life inside it was shaped by constraints that were both political and psychological. Outside the gates, the Netherlands was careful, polite, and firm. Wilhelm could remain, but he would not become a problem. His freedom of movement was limited to a small area around the estate unless he notified officials in advance, a rule that turned every longer trip into a reminder of his changed status. He could exist, but he could not fully re-enter the world. Inside, he responded by tightening routine. Days became structured, visitors were controlled, etiquette remained, even when the audience had shrunk to a handful of loyalists and curious guests. The household functioned with a formality that could seem out of proportion to its setting. But the point was never proportion. The point was continuity. When your legitimacy has been stripped away by events you cannot reverse, continuity becomes a substitute for power. The house itself did some of the work. The rooms were filled with objects that had been chosen, transported, and placed with intent. The collection came from palaces in Berlin and Potsdam, and the museum's own description emphasizes how these furnishings allowed Wilhelm to live in exile up to his standards, despite the smaller scale. The items were not only valuable, they were coded. A chair is never just a chair when it has been sat in by monarchy. A tapestry is never only fabric when it once hung behind decisions that moved armies. By surrounding himself with those objects, Wilhelm made the house argue that the old order still had weight. Yet the tension in House Dawn was that it preserved the appearance of authority while exposing its fragility. Wilhelm could keep uniforms, but he no longer commanded forces. He could keep portraits of ancestors, but he no longer controlled succession in a meaningful way. The house became a museum of a living man's past, even while he still walked through it, an arrangement that blurs the line between home and exhibit. Some habits from these years were practical, others symbolic. One of the most repeated images of Wilhelm at dawn is the former emperor as woodcutter, spending hours chopping down trees and stacking logs, an activity that reportedly denuded parts of the mature landscape over time. The detail is often presented as eccentric, but it also reads like a coping mechanism, a ruler who could no longer shape nations, still shaping something tangible, tree by tree, with his own hands. It is hard to imagine a clearer symbol of reduced scale. Politics did not stop at the gates, even if Wilhelm tried to keep it outside. Germany in the 1920s was unstable. The Weimar Republic struggled with inflation, political violence, and competing visions of the future. Monarchists sometimes treated Wilhelm as a living token, a possible restoration figure. Others saw him as a burden, a reminder of a war Germany could not afford to romanticize. In his Dutch exile, he watched the transformation of the country that had expelled him, reading, corresponding, and receiving visitors who carried news and agendas. House Dawn was quiet, but it was not isolated from history's momentum. And then, loss entered the house in a way that no collection could soften. On April 11, 1921, Wilhelm's first wife, Augusta Victoria, died at House Dawn. Her death stripped away a layer of continuity he had been trying to preserve. She was not merely a spouse, she was part of the public and private image of the Hohenzollern court. Her body was taken back to Germany for burial, a journey that underscored the strange status of Dawn itself. The emperor lived in exile, but death still pulled the family story back across the border. Afterward, the house continued, but with a sharper edge of finality. The world inside was not only preserved, it was also shrinking. The last time Wilhelm II looked out from the windows of power, he was still surrounded by ministers, courtiers, and the heavy certainty of empire. Then, in early November 1918, certainty collapsed faster than any army could retreat. Revolutions spread through German cities, the imperial government fractured, and the title German Emperor and King of Prussia suddenly belonged to a man who could no longer safely remain inside his own borders. In those days, the question was not about dignity, it was about survival, and about what history does to rulers when they stop being useful. Wilhelm was at army headquarters in Spa, in occupied Belgium, when the crisis reached him. The war was ending, and the political ground under the monarchy was breaking apart. Advisors argued over abdication, over the possibility of a regency, over whether his presence would inflame the streets. Behind the arguments was the reality. The emperor had become a liability to the state that once defined him. On November 9, 1918, the German chancellorship publicly announced his abdication, and a republic was proclaimed. Wilhelm himself resisted the word, but resistance did not change the direction of events. By November 10th, he crossed into the Netherlands, a neutral country that had stayed out of the war, and asked for asylum. The first shelter was not a palace, it was Amerongen Castle, the home of Count Godard van Oldenburg-Bentinck, where Wilhelm lived under a watchful, uncomfortable hospitality. He was safe, but he was also contained, politically radioactive, diplomatically inconvenient, and for the Allies, a lingering symbol of the war they wanted to punish. In Europe's newspapers, he was alternately blamed, mocked, feared, or forgotten, sometimes all on the same page. In private, the exile began to take on a different character. Less a temporary retreat, more a long sentence with no fixed end. It was from Amerongen that Wilhelm started searching for a permanent refuge. What he needed was not only a house, but an environment that could be controlled. He had lived his life inside architecture designed to announce permanence, and now permanence had been taken from him by decree and defeat. The instinct that remained was to rebuild a smaller version of that world, not for governing, but for living inside an idea of what had been lost. In 1919, he bought Huis Dawn, a country house near Utrecht, paying what contemporary accounts record as 500,000 guilders. The estate was not grand in the way Berlin or Potsdam had been grand. That was the point. It could be managed. It had gates. It had a park large enough to walk without meeting strangers. It had rooms that could be reshaped into a court in miniature, a stage set where the old rules would still apply if he insisted on them hard enough. He moved in during May 1920, and almost immediately Huis Dawn began to change character. Not through new construction, but through an invasion of objects. The Dutch countryside started receiving the physical remains of a fallen empire, arriving not as a single dramatic convoy, but as repeated, deliberate shipments that made the exile feel permanent. Over the period from late 1919 into early 1922, multiple trains arrived at nearby stations carrying his possessions: furniture, paintings, tapestries, silver, porcelain, and the everyday machinery of aristocratic life. One widely reported accounting describes 5 trains pulling 59 carriages between September 1919 and February 1922, filled with his belongings. The museum itself emphasizes the scale in a different way, noting that Huis Dawn was furnished with the contents of 64 railway carriages from Germany. Either way, the meaning is the same. Exile did not mean traveling light. Exile meant moving an entire identity, room by room, across a border. Inside the house, the arrangement was not random. Portraits and family images established lineage in corridors and reception spaces. Furniture from Berlin and Potsdam created continuity with the rooms he could no longer enter. Cabinets displayed objects that had once been part of official life: gifts, ceremonial pieces, costly materials shaped into symbols of rank. The effect was uncanny. In a small Dutch estate, the visual language of monarchy was reconstructed with meticulous care, as if the environment could argue back against the world outside. Outside those walls, the Netherlands maintained a careful distance. Wilhelm was given asylum, but he was not allowed to become a roaming political center. One frequently repeated detail is that he was permitted to travel freely only within about a 10-kilometer radius of the house, with further journeys requiring advance notice to local officials. The restriction mattered less for the miles than for what it implied. The former emperor, who had once been the state's highest authority, now needed permission to go beyond a small circle of countryside. That small humiliation shaped his habits. If the world insisted he was smaller now, he could at least build a world where he did not have to feel it.